Hi, I'm Professor Will Daddario, and I'd like to give a micro lecture about ritual.
Oh, that's a toothbrush. I'll talk about that later.
Yeah, anyway, where do you start? When you want to talk about ritual, when you want to think about ritual, what should you do? Where should you go? Well, why not just start with Google? Google Images. Search for ritual in Google Images, and what do you find?
Well, you get these subgroupings, and the first one you see is Satanic Ritual. So, okay, let's take a look at these. Um, you look at them, and what do you see? You see creatures, people, humans, and gods interacting with one another. Always strange lighting effect candles because the nighttime is somehow important. But more than that, it's an activity, something out of the ordinary, something that requires a group of people, and that's just Satanic Ritual. And when you move from satanic to the next category, which is pagan ritual, you see that these distinctions are largely arbitrary. You have much of the same imagery here, but what perhaps is interesting to notice in the pagan ritual is that religion takes less of an orthodox approach and sort of becomes more of a communal, everyday type of activity. Religion is no longer religio in the sense of binding to a god, but is now binding to some sort of other spirit, and hence humans are not always the most important thing. Sometimes the object is the most important. Objects endowed with certain magical qualities, rituals unlock or help us to read these properties. And when you can do that, you start to recognize that ritual is all about time, time in the universal sense, ritual linked to time.
And it's not time generally, it's time in a specific sense. Time as in that thing that makes us human, that proves that we are not gods, that highlights our finitude on the planet. I think that the ritual is an activity that we engage in under the darkness of night at the time when the witches come out to think about that which is larger than us and connect to the big unknowns and the uncertainties of the universe. Anyway, when you go through the images presented on Google, you definitely develop a large vocabulary, some adjectives, some keywords that you can use to talk about ritual, and that's great and it's important. We're going to tie it all together in a minute or so, but before we do that, I want to go into a little bit the etymology of the word ritual because it is quite fascinating.
So, three quick steps here. The first is the word ritual, obviously, and it enters into English in the 1560s, though it's clearly much older than that. Let's say it goes back to the word ritualis in Latin, meaning relating to religious rites. Obviously, here, rites refers to some sort of event, much like the dark, cloudy at night events that we saw earlier. But from there, we jump into the word rite. And the word rite shows up in the early 14th century, also with a Latin origin, but it's there in the red text that is particularly interesting, coming from perhaps a word meaning to count or to number, which in Greek was understood as arithmos, to put into number order. And in my mind, what starts happening here is a series of questions. What does ritual have to do with numbering? Or, to put it a different way, what does it have to do with ordering? And the third jump, even stranger perhaps, read. From right ritual to right to read. How do we get there? Well, when you parse through this text from Etymology online, etymonline.com, you see that the key words here are uh, read, explain, learn by reading, put in order. There's something about rituals, rites, that has to do with ordering, and ordering in the particular sense of putting into order as one was to make order out of chaos. More than just making order out of chaos, you're doing this to advise people in some way. Ritual is an act of advice or counsel given to many about how to make order out of chaos. That, in any way, is my argument. We move from the obvious, ritual, meaning relation to religious observance or a religious passage, and we arrive at an act or an event of putting things in order. Perhaps capital T things there. And order, also capital O, order in the sense of preserving. This order has a preservative function. Humans can drive off chaos by bringing order to the world through daily activities. Now, they don't look so daily and normal at first, of course, because of all of the, say, happening at night with candles, and it seems kind of scary and very specific.
But over time, don't we start to see a shift from the big religious, capital R with a God, understanding of right to a everyday, banal type of activity? Before we get there, one more thing, which is that in addition to the performers, the people doing the ritual, we clearly also have to consider the audience. The notion of ritual seems to require an audience because the recipients of the advice expressed through this activity of ordering, well, those people are the most important because they're the ones who are required to go forth into the world and act on the advice in order to keep the chaos at bay. And it's not hard then from there to understand why scholars of theater and performance are so interested in ritual. Consider the sacrificial goat ritual of ancient Greece, which we know under the word tragedy, tragoidia, meaning sacrifice in the presence of a goat, or sacrificing of a goat, or the jumping over a goat. It's not clear exactly what it means, but we call it tragedy, and it unfolded as theater. There was some sort of aspect of ritual to that. And in what I'm trying to say here is that maybe the whole ancient Greek tragedy was a part of ordering the chaos of the world, using reason to overcome the irrationality of the universe. You don't just see it in ancient Greece, you also see it prior to and also contemporaneous with ancient Greek tragedy in the Sanskrit tradition. The Kutiyatam Sanskrit tradition of Kerala, India, for example, where performers worked in a square-shaped space in order to suture earth to the heavens, and if anything went wrong with the performance, then everything was really messed up. Anyway, theater and performance scholars have been looking at ritual for a long time in this sense, looking at how humans order the world through performance or theater. But I think we should also talk about the daily life contemporary understanding of ritual, the banal aspect of ritual. This is something that psychoanalysts, psychologists have been looking at for a long time, and I'm compelled here to read an excerpt from a book by this guy, um, Bartemeyer, Leo Bartemeyer, who coincidentally is my great grandfather. It's an article called Accounting Compulsion, a contribution to the unconscious meaning of time. And remember, in those definitions that I just said, there's a surprising sort of etymological part of the word ritual and rite that has to do with counting and ordering. Let me just read this a little bit to you. It's a fact of our common observation that an occasional compulsiveness in counting is one of the manifestations of the psychopathology of everyday life. En route to the theater, for example, many persons remain uneasy and only become more comfortable after they have counted their tickets again, although they know they have the correct number. He goes on to talk about some patients he has who have compulsive counting issues. Further down, he actually references an article by Sigmund Freud from 1895, who wrote briefly about a woman who, quote, became obliged to count the boards in the floor, the steps in the staircase, etc., acts which she performed in a state of ridiculous distress. She had begun the counting in order to turn her mind from obsessive ideas of temptation. She had succeeded in so doing, but the impulse to count had replaced the original obsession. Do you see where I'm going with this? This woman, in this particular case, had made a ritual out of counting that was made so as to keep chaos at bay. She was trying to keep the chaos of life at bay through counting. And eventually, he talks about his own patient who says, my head is a clock, an apparatus. I make the time, the new time as it should be. My patient always said she represented the number 12, and once remarked that she often felt tight inside like a clock, which, with one more turn, will burst its spring. And that might all sound very strange. We might also not think this sounds like everyday life. We might also think, oh, poor her. But don't we always do this? Always, every day. All of us do the same thing. We keep time with our obsessive little rituals, and they might not seem like rituals, they might not seem strange, but this is where we come back to the toothbrush. Yes, every morning I bookend my life, and then again at night, with this little ritual of brushing my teeth. And on the surface, I could state that dental hygiene drives this activity, but I could quickly theorize greater implications. Take, for instance, the well-known fact that to dream of losing teeth means that one has a preoccupation with death. Is it possible that I reckon with death each morning and each night through the ritual of brushing my teeth?
To go back to Daddy Bart for a second, in his essay he writes, the study of the counting compulsion of this patient brings into bolder relief some of the facts previously reported by other investigators, and it also adds some new details not hitherto described. The duodecimal system of counting which she employed was not only derived from what she had learned about telling the time, but also represented an archaic method of reckoning. What I'm getting at is that even such a banal micro performance as brushing your teeth is an instance for us to ritually reckon with our place in the universe as beings that are going to die. And we might seem like we're a long way away from those images that we started with of people in masks dancing around in candlelight in the forest at night, but I don't think we are. I think rituals are, interestingly, methods of gaining power over the chaos of time and reckoning with our finitude. Something to think about next time you brush your teeth.